Are you ready for an impossible question? Who is the best Survivor player ever? Not most entertaining or most important, just the best at playing the game. Trust me, it is a hard question, and there are many up for contention. To me, these top players all have arguments for being crowned the best. So let's go through each case and ask the question, are they the best Survivor? Well, what is there to say about Tony Vlachos being the best Survivor ever that is not stupidly apparent to any Survivor fan? I do believe that every other winner I have covered genuinely does have a case as the best to ever play, but this video, the Tony video, is probably the most obvious selection in this entire series to any learned viewer. Why is it that throughout the series I have sprinkled little critiques and comparisons of Tony's game throughout the other videos? It's because Tony is the guy that all other players with a claim at the best have to be compared to. He doesn't just have an argument, he is the consensus best player ever. He is Survivor Michael Jordan. Tony is the only player who visually on screen appears to be one of the best players ever, and is at a bare minimum tied as the most accomplished player ever, having 2 sole Survivor titles along with Sandra. But what Sandra has in wins, she lacks in a superficially strong, dominant game style. What players with similar strong gameplay to Tony, like Tom Westman, don't have is multi-season success. Once more, just to say it again, Tony is the only player to have his cake and eat it too, whose accolades match their on-screen dominance. Here's another way to visualize how uniquely great Tony is at Survivor. Imagine that you split his Survivor days in half and analyzed each half as a separate player. Both of these players would still easily rank as some of the strongest winners of all time, a distinction that can only be given to the stellar career of Tony Vlachos. Let's dive into a quick review of both halves of Tony. In Survivor Season 28, Cagayan, Tony was electric. You watch him in that season, endlessly bouncing around, endlessly scheming, and go, yeah, this is pretty fun, but nobody wins playing like this. It's what we've been programmed to expect as viewers of the show. Yet episode after episode, somehow the man survived, until he was sitting at the live reunion receiving a landslide victory. Tony's first win was like nothing anyone has ever seen before, and from my perspective, changed how Survivor players played from Season 28 onwards. Gone were the Survivor dark ages of methodical, systematic winners who were the obvious frontrunners by the merge. Tony introduced the explosively chaotic and fast-paced strategy that we are so fond and probably slightly sick of, which dominated the dozen or so seasons that have come after Cagayan and has evolved into modern Survivor as we know it. It was truly a one-of-a-kind win, and if Tony never came back to the game after this first appearance, he'd still be lauded as one of the most influential and talented survivors to ever play. Yet he did make a return appearance on Season 40, Winners at War. Like all returning seasons, great players such as Tony will always have it more difficult coming back due to their legacy. Tony being a winner isn't as extraordinary as it usually is, since this is a season of all winners, but still, he was probably the most influential player of the last 20 or so seasons when Winners at War aired. So how'd he do? Well, Tony won. He became the winner of winners, with 0 votes written against him the entire season. This was against what is, without doubt, the most talented competition any Survivor has gone through to secure a win. I'm not going to count every player who played on Winners at War as having been defeated by Tony, since there were plenty who were never even on his tribe, but the list of players who Tony either voted out or merely outlasted while on the same tribe includes Survivor greats like Sandra Diaz-Twine, Wendell Holland, Sophie Clark, Tyson Apostle, twice, Kim Spradlin-Wolf, Jeremy Collins, Denise Stapley, Sarah Lacina, and Natalie Anderson. No insult, by the way, to all the players I didn't mention in that list. They are still, after all, winners, each arguably the best player on their season, all of which soundly defeated by Tony Vlachos. So how's he done it? Tony's game was refined and built upon from season 28 to 40, but what has always been there from day one to the second win is Tony's strategic ability. In the outwit part of the game, Tony is unrivaled. I firmly believe that Tony's survivor brain doesn't take a rest till he falls unconscious. Just like his legs, it never stops running, and it shows. Tony combines the most ingenious survivor mind of the last 20 seasons with preternatural timing and execution abilities. His mental motor had him in Cagayan alone finding 3 hidden immunity idols and hiding in spy shacks and up trees snooping for information. Once he's gathered the information he needs, and Tony's Nostradamus-like foresight has predicted who's the biggest threat to take out, no one is stopping him. No survivor I've ever seen is better at blindsiding than Tony. He seemed to have endless ways to ensure that at the very last second who he wanted gone was snuffed. All of this has created a grocery list of strategic moves that would each define the whole careers of lesser players. You have the flip for the LJ blindside, booking Spencer into misplaying his idol in the Jeremiah vote, flipping again for the Jeffra blindside, bluffing his idol's powers, backstabbing Trish, and getting Wu to take him to the end, all in just season 28. There are also countless smaller aspects to Tony's game, so many that there are plenty that never even made it onto the screen. Some of these finer details include making sure all of his big moves happen at Tribal for the jury to see, or sitting at Final Tribal Council in this sort of reserved and meek posture that promotes empathy. Unlike some other players who have their heads up their own ass at the Final Tribal, Tony thoroughly explains all of his moves as rational acts of self-defense that had to be done. It's behavior that garners sympathy from the jury and is what pushes his chances of winning that much further than anyone else. That talk of jury management transitions well into the rest of his social game, which first, as a concept, needs some explaining. Let me explain how I have viewed it throughout this series and what I imagine is the definitions others use, even if they don't know it. Whereas strategy is the execution of opportunity and power in the game of Survivor, the social game is the acquiescence of this power. It's about how to generate the relationship you want from your fellow players in order to navigate through the game. Hopefully, throughout the series, I have shown the best players can have excellent social games without being stereotypically affable. Because really, it's more about garnering respect than being likable. Just look at the very first season of the show. All this to say that even as a rookie in Cagayan, Tony had a great social game, something I don't think enough people praise. Like, sure, you know him for finding idols, but his game goes deeper than that. The idols are just one of Tony's endless tools to swing the vote his way. He'll use the threat of an idol, along with constant promises, half-truths, and disgruntled voting blocks to acquire the numbers. He had people fearing to write his name down at Tribal, too scared to endure whatever crazy revenge plan he'd come up with. Tony had allies genuinely loyal to him. And like I explained before, this game translated very well to the Cagayan jury, who genuinely respected Tony and gave him all but one winning vote over the much more lovable and easygoing Wu. But maybe you want to bring up how he needs certain allies to build that social game. Specifically, critics of Tony's gameplay will bring up how much his wins relied on key allies, Trish in Cagayan and then Sarah Lucina in his later appearance. The general narrative is that these essential allies tempered Tony's worst tendencies, and their social games were all but necessary in keeping Tony's explosive playstyle afloat. Now, I will not diminish these players. Trish is one of the better players on Cagayan, while Sarah has proven herself to be flat out one of the best players ever. These women were both essential components of the alliances Tony formed in his winning seasons. But why is this a knock against him? How is it a flaw of Tony's game that he consistently makes trusted allies of other good players? Is it not the point of alliances to create a group that covers the weaknesses of playing alone, Can the best players just not play with helpful allies anymore? And although Trish and Sarah may have helped restrain Tony's worst inclinations, let's not pretend he would be this socially inept, untrustworthy troll without them. Hell, in both seasons, Tony went behind these allies' backs to do his own thing. In both seasons, Tony votes for someone Trish or Sarah wants to keep, using different groups of people whose votes he alone controlled, and after it was all said and done, got Sarah and Trish to re-trust him. Both times he made and remended ride-or-die relationships with players that supposedly held up his whole social game. How dependent was he really? Yet another critique of his game is his second season of the show. Tony does not go straight from season 28 to 40, as in between he came back on the all-returning season 34, Game Changers. There isn't too much to say since he was voted out day 6 during his second tribal. This should be damning, right? How can the best player ever have gone out second? Tell me if I sound like a broken record after saying it plenty of times in this series, but the best players are handicapped by their own legacies when coming back. Tony stuck out like a sore thumb, and his target was further emphasized by the comically low star power of the season called Game Changers. And by no means am I trying to offend any of the players, but besides Malcolm and Sandra, there were no one else even close to Tony's level on his tribe. He was dead the minute he got off the boat and saw the competition, and he even admits that. Everyone else admits that as well.
I have a feeling a lot of people are gunning for Tony.
I mean, there's no scarier player out here than Tony.
Yeah.
I'm coming back to get my ass handed to me, I think. These people out to get me, man.
I think you're right.
I know I'm right.
But sure, maybe this version of Tony was just too much. He couldn't control his own manic personality and needed certain players to put out his own fires. Whatever, I'll give that to you. I'll give it to you that in Cagayan he never once won individual immunity, even though he was literally cast as a brawny-looking dude for the show. Maybe I'll even add, in the very final challenge that he's completely out of, Wu wins it a second over Cass. And although Tony is able to convince Wu to take him to the end, even I won't believe he would be able to persuade Cass. I'll concede all of this, because for how amazing Cagayan Tony is as a player, he is not the most complete, outstanding survivor we have ever seen. This is. Tony came back on season 40 with a vengeance, prepared to adapt his game against harsher competition and win yet again. Some people will have you believe Tony had an unfair advantage in this season due to his poor showing in Game Changers, which lowered his threat level. And maybe it did slightly, but Tony wasn't any bum. He was still clearly in the top echelon of winners that returned and still had to get through 39 days of the most elite cast the show has ever seen. He accomplished this feat by playing what is, without question, the greatest returning game ever played in the show's history. Tony had been critiqued in the past for not being able to manage his threat level, so for all the pre-merge he lied low, actively going under the radar to survive into the merge intact. Tony never won an individual immunity before, so this time he won 4. He was seen as too explosive and reckless, so although he still got up to his Tony antics, he is a more restrained, cold-blooded puppet master throughout the post-merge. His game revolves more around manipulating key voters and keeping allies than ever before. His intuition is still second to none. He knows when players don't or do have idols, and if people will be problems for him not just then and there, but several tribal councils into the future. And don't worry, that excellent strategical brain is still there. For a complete showing of Winners at War Tony at the peak of his powers, look no further than the 11th episode of the season. Tony finds the 4th hidden immunity idol of his career, but that is quickly overshadowed by something more engaging: extortion. Specifically, Tony has a disadvantage played against him by Natalie Anderson, who's on the edge of extinction. Tony can't vote or play the next immunity challenge unless he's able to pay a certain number of fire tokens, which are like in-game currency. Tony seems completely screwed, except he somehow finds a way to convince 3 of his allies to give away their fire tokens in exchange for essentially nothing, except for Tony's continued trust. With the extortion paid, he's allowed to play in the immunity challenge, which he then wins. Leading up to the tribal, Tony hatches what is probably his single greatest strategic move ever. The plan for Tony's main alliance is to split the votes between two people, Jeremy and Michelle. However, this really opens an opportunity up for Tony. You see, he isn't scared of either Jeremy or Michelle. He's scared of Sophie, who is growing ever closer to his closest ally, Sarah. In order to extinguish that before it becomes a problem, he plans to vote Sophie. He also uses the votes of the two people on the other side of the majority, Michelle and Jeremy, to vote Sophie as well. Finally, Tony pulls in the disparate vote of Nick, who lies near the bottom of the tribe, to form a slim plurality in what becomes a 4-3-2 vote. Mind you, Sophie also had a hidden immunity idol that she totally would have played had she known about the plan that got flushed out with her elimination. The amount of timing, coordination, and covert planning needed to pull this off without close allies knowing could have only been done by Tony Vlachos, and it caps off one of the greatest single-episode performances of any player the show has seen. Of course, Tony still had a final push to make it to the end after this, which seems rather easy as him and his alliance march to the end. He's able to reconcile with Sarah, and the two, who have now played with each other for 3 straight seasons, seem like one of the greatest duos in Survivor's history. But of course, nothing's ever that simple on Survivor, and a wrench is thrown into the game. For Tony, that wrench is Natalie Anderson, herself one of the greatest players of her and Tony's era, and rather than extortion, this time returned from the edge of extinction, a kind of Survivor limbo for everyone who's been voted out. She has had all the time possible to live alongside the jury and knows exactly what must be done to secure a win. Eliminate Tony, the most dominant player left in the game. It's the final 6. Tony is the only one in his alliance who believes that Natalie Anderson has an idol. They are blindsided, and every idol, including Tony's, is flushed out of the game, while his ally Denise is still sent home. Final 5. In a pretty unprecedented move, his other ally, Ben, essentially quits at the finish line, asking to be voted out, which ends up happening. Now at the final 4, the groups are split between Natalie and Michelle, and Tony and Sarah. Natalie wins the final immunity, and sends the 2 allies to a fire-making duel that no matter what will split up the 2 for the last day of the game, eliminated from the competition by the hands of the other. It's a showdown that couldn't have been written any better, and is one of the most dramatic moments in the show. If Tony wins, he almost certainly wins the game, and will be etched in Survivor legend, the most electric and revolutionary player in years, who won in one of the most exciting ways possible, who disappointed expectations in a returning campaign, only to come back in an attempt to crown himself the champion of champions. The title of King of Survivor was just one challenge away. Of course he was going to overcome it. He's Tony Vlachos, the most talented survivor we've ever seen, the most accomplished survivor who's ever played, the best survivor of all time.
I'm sorry, I don't talk Lammer. I'm supposed to talk Lammer to you.